Hi, I'm Kristen Butler, Director of Programs here at the Delaplane Art Center. Before I hand things over to our exhibitions manager, Corey Fry, I wanted to mention that if you enjoy our programs, exhibitions, classes, and workshops, consider supporting us by becoming a member. Members get a lot of great benefits, including discounts on classes and workshops. You can find more information on our website. And now, Delaplane Exhibitions Manager, Corey Fry.
Really glad to be with you all today. Thanks so much for joining us. First, I want to mention we have 4 new exhibitions that have opened today at the Delaplane. So if you feel comfortable coming out and checking them out, I'd highly encourage it. We're talking to the Washington Waxworks today, and seeing their work in person is just it opens up another dimension rather than just seeing the virtual exhibitions that we provide. But we understand, everybody's being cautious right now, and we do encourage everyone's safety. We are implementing social distancing at the Delaplane. We do ask that folks wear masks when they come in, but we are open for business. Our hours are Monday through Saturday, 9 to 5, and Sunday from 11 to 5. So come out and check out all the exhibitions that we have going on. If you're not comfortable coming out, or if you're at a distance and you can't check out the exhibitions in person, we have created virtual exhibitions of all the shows that we have at the Delaplane, and those are listed on our website. And we're going to be posting a link in the chat to our current exhibitions page, which will show you what we have on exhibit and how to view all the virtual exhibitions. So check those things out. And without further ado, I want to introduce our guests today, the Washington Waxworks. So Washington Waxworks is a collective of 6 encaustic artists working in the Washington, D.C. area. Encaustic is hot wax, the transformative process of encasing, painting, baking, embedding, and collaging elements with this ancient medium is Washington Waxworks' passion. Each artist interprets using wax with individualized technical expression, exposing viewers to new and uniquely captivating art forms. And the 6 members of the Washington Waxworks that we have today with us are Kathleen Anderson, David Evans, Nancy Haskin, Marty Itner, Katie Del Kaufman, and Kevin Milstead. We're really excited to have them all with us. We're going to show a quick introductory video, and then we'll meet all of our artists.
Making encaustic art is not for the faint of heart. I think it's one of the hardest things I've ever tried to do.
Encaustic is not easy, but it is an accessible medium.
And you got an impression of far greater depth than the few millimeters of wax that are actually causing that impression. And that was just mesmerizing to me.
I think it's important to find something that you really enjoy doing, that you can put your heart and soul in.
A lot of the times it's magical and wonderful, and they see things in your art that you haven't seen, and that is the most amazing experience that you can have.
After working all week, coming here to work on encaustic is totally opposite. It's free form, whatever happens, happens. It's just a nice release. It's a totally different experience, and I really enjoy it.
I like the way it looks. And I was also excited by the fact that I had not lost my imagination, even though I had been working in a tiny little space. It was all in there waiting to be used.
We were fascinated by what each of us were doing. Everything that each one of us does is so different than the other, and we just kept wanting to see more, and we kept wanting to do more. So we formed Washington Waxworks.
Even though they all took my collage class, each artist works in a completely different way now.
My name's Kevin Milstead. I'm an architect. I specialize in historic preservation, and I do encaustic artwork.
My name is Nancy Haskin, and I'm the Senior Graphic Designer for the Freer and Sackler Galleries at the Smithsonian. I've been working as an encaustic artist for about 4 or 5 years now.
My name is Kathleen Anderson, and I am a retired special educator from Prince George's County, Maryland, and have become an encaustic artist.
My name is Marty Itner, and I am a creative director, so do a fair amount of design for nonprofit organizations. I'm also an encaustic artist.
My name is Katie Del Kaufman. I taught at the Corcoran. I also teach in my studio at the Gateway Arts Center in Brentwood, Maryland. And I'm also an encaustic artist.
My name is David Evans. I've had a number of creative professions over the years. I've been a graphic designer, an art director, a creative director on 3 continents. I've been a documentary photographer and filmmaker, and now I'm an encaustic artist.
I've done drawing, I've done a little painting, but I felt like I needed a new outlet.
Kevin's work seems a little more organic, maybe. He's experimenting with plant material and roots, and now he seems like he's experimenting more with using metal. And it's kind of an interesting combination between the wax and the metal, so I'll be curious to see what he's going to be creating in the future.
Nancy's work is more collage, more paper-oriented. What I really like about her work right now that she's doing is she's taking old pieces of metal, rusting them up, and then transferring the rust to paper and using that as part of her design. And I like that rust color. It's very interesting to me.
Kathy has a wonderful lyrical sensibility. She has a wonderful color sense. They feel to me kind of like water, and the fluidity of the wax is very visible in her work. It's much more spontaneous, much more free.
Katie's encaustic style is probably the most evolved out of all of us because she's a working artist. So with Katie, I don't think she has one style. Her whole life is artistic exploration, and I think that's what we get from Katie.
David's been focusing on kind of geometric shapes and building up layers and layers and smoothing them out. A really cool, unique technique. The end product is just amazing. He's really mastered it.
I've always been in love with Marty's collages, and a lot of them have a mystery to them. There's definitely a story behind the things that Marty does. Their ability to communicate a story, I think, is one of the things I really love about Marty's pieces.
So much of art is being by yourself in your studio, and having a group of people that you meet with regularly is just a tremendous support system.
Being with these people, it will be a much more enjoyable process because we have a lot of fun.
And I enjoy it because it's a little different than other people's kind of artwork. So as long as my interest is there, I will continue to create things. And as long as I'm encouraged, I will continue to do it.
You know, we've all been doing art on the side, but I think this is just a way to unify it and actually kind of encourage each other. So it's sort of been an interesting journey of one leading to the other. So who knows what'll be next.
I think there's an advantage in showing with a group. We could have gallery exhibitions on the East Coast, on the West Coast.
I think it highlights the differences in the way that the encaustic medium can be used.
And our voice become one of the defining voices in an encaustic movement. I think we have that potential, and that's what I really hope for us.
That was fantastic. So I'm just really excited to dive in with you guys and talk about your processes, your interests. So we're going to first be talking with Kathleen Anderson. Kathleen, thank you so much for being with us. We're really excited to hear what you all have to share with us today.
Hi, my name is Kathy Anderson, and I'm an encaustic artist with Washington Waxworks. What I'm going to be talking about today is my newest works using monoprints. Most of my pieces are based around color and texture. In order to make a monoprint, I use an anodized aluminum flat board, and it's on little legs, and there's a heat element underneath it. I melt colored wax onto that top, and here you'll see a texture in that. And I used a hot plate, that hot pad that I got at the grocery store. I tend to use things I find around my house to create texture and design. So once I got this texture on here, I then put a piece of paper on top of that color, and I use a brayer and I press the paper into the wax so the wax soaks up into that rice paper. And then I remove the rice paper and I have an encaustic monoprint. And that shows how it's being soaked up into the paper. In this one, I've used different colors, and I'm using a wallboard correction tape that you use to fill holes in the walls. And it has a nice grid to it. So I put different colors down. You'll notice that you can mix colors in wax just like you would do in watercolors. So I have two or three different colors on that flat board. This is the wall tape that I used. And this is after I have taken off the paper. So that is what's left on the aluminum plate. And then you see it here in the paper, and you see how you get that little grid pattern. I use that grid pattern in my artwork. So I cut it out, and you'll see the colors and the grid pattern both. Here is a piece that has already been started. It has colors down and many layers of wax on top of it. And you have to melt each layer of wax into the next layer of wax to maintain a strength and it holds together. So I put the tape from the paper onto that piece I was working on, and I melted it in with a small craft iron so that the wax on the paper melts into the wax on the piece. And then I will put more wax on top of all of that. These are pieces that shows the end result. This is companions, and where you see color is where there is monotypes, monoprints. Again, you see that where the color is, there are monoprints, and then in the middle, you'll see the texture. So I tend to use texture and color together, which is what interests me the most. Again, this is the color part is the monoprint. This one's a little harder to discern exactly where the monoprint is, but it's underneath where the sun is spurting up. And then I use pan pastel colors on a sponge or my finger to help enhance color. That's how I have been making my most recent pieces. My earlier pieces are quite different, which are also included in this show. Thank you very much. And David Evans is next.
So thanks, everybody. So what I'm going to do is take you on a little journey of how I was first inspired by my explorations in encaustic and to where it eventually took me. I studied art and design, printmaking, drawing, painting in 3 different universities. Spent over 20 years as a documentary photographer and filmmaker. So storytelling and photographic visuals are very important to me and found their way into my work a lot. In my work as a documentary filmmaker and photographer, I traveled a lot and I collected a lot. I was really fascinated by folk art and picked up different baubles here and there. Some of those found their way into my work. I'm also kind of a political news junkie. And in my past lives, I was an international election observer with the Carter Center, and that tuned me into a lot of international issues. And also just a collector of art, photography, folk art, little baubles and things. So when Katie, one of our Washington Waxworks members, first taught us all how to do this, I was exploring these things that I was familiar with. So on the right is sort of my homage to Paul Klee and Twittering Machine, but also just exploring these textures and the way the wax works and how you can build it up and how you can inscribe. And on the left, I incorporated some of my collecting into that with some antique milagros from Venezuela and some sapphires I brought home from Sri Lanka. I picked up this kind of 150-year-old whimsy bottle at a market in Paris and then used imagery from that to create some of my earlier pieces, also embedding different pieces into the work to sort of enhance the storytelling aspect of it. A lot of people come to my home and they ask if I'm a religious person because a lot of the folk art I collect has its roots in spiritual expression. That could be animist, that could be Islam, that could be Christian. So I'm not a particularly religious person, but there's an awful lot of spiritual visuals in the work that I collect, and that found its way into my work as well. Sort of from the political news, junkie side, the one on the left, I did the first day I became aware of what was going on in Aleppo, Syria. I was just so disturbed and moved by the destruction, the wholesale destruction of what was going on there. And I wanted to express that in some of the encaustic work I was doing. I ended up calling this piece a catalog of blunders, which is how Winston Churchill referred to war, as a catalog of blunders. The piece on the right is more of a memorial piece, sort of the stripes of counting the dead and the red of the blood. Both of these also harken back to my travel and my photography because they're both images of concrete. The one on the left is a concrete floor at the MTV studios in Sao Paulo, where I was picking up some equipment for a shoot. And the one on the right was just a random cement wall I took a picture of in Sri Lanka. But they found their way back into my encaustic work. The one on the left is another photograph of a cement that I built up encaustic wax, paint, paper, collage, just as an abstract expression while I'm still exploring what it is that encaustic can do and beginning to understand the translucency and how to use that. On the right, you can see the edge of the cradle, which I covered in 999 silver leaf, and then really loved the way some of that silver leaf folded its way onto the front edges of the composition. This was a photograph from a storefront in San Francisco on Market Street that had a lot of film and bubbles and translucency of its own. I laid that photograph onto a board and then built up other layers of translucency with paint, paper, and encaustic wax. This was an early piece too, where I was still exploring layers and how to sort of control it a little more. And that's when a light bulb went off for me about I really wanted to control the wax. I didn't want the wax to dictate that it always had to be full of texture. I love that. But I wanted to see, could I control the textures, the layers, and make each layer distinct? So I reached back into my sort of catalog of travel memories and remembered being enamored with all the mosaics, the mid-century mosaics in Caracas when I lived there. They were on walls publicly, as well as pieces of art, but a lot of public mosaic. And I began to explore how much I could control each layer and make it smooth and reject texture. This is one I did where I just took it to the nth degree, just how crazy could I get? There are layers in this one on the left that are so far deep that they disappeared. So I learned kind of how many layers can I do before I lose what's underneath. And the one on the right is a detail taken from the top that shows you, I think, a little more clearly how those layers express themselves, even though it's just a few millimeters of wax, can really identify each layer. Same kind of thing here, just very much trying to control the individual layers. I wanted to show you a little bit about process here. This is a piece that's in a show. It's an earlier piece. Starts with a sketch. Not always, but in this case it did. I covered a board in gray encaustic medium and smoothed it down with a torch. And then I incised the first layer of the visual, which then I go back and fill in with hot wax. So you can see here, this is the first layer on the left after I filled it with hot wax, all those different things I incised. And then on the right, the very first layer after I scraped it down with a razor blade to achieve the cleaner shapes. This is me using one of the many tools I've sort of began to obsessively collect, that I cut out the different shapes, be these circles, squares, freeform lines. And then I fill those little wells with hot wax and let them cool. Once everything is cooled and it's very hard, I go back with a razor blade. It's kind of a laborious process and scrape away everything except the encaustic medium that I've left in the image that in the areas that I've incised. And then I cover all of that. After all of that work, I cover it in a thick layer of clear beeswax, encaustic medium, and you can see it almost disappears. But once I incise the next layer and scrape that down, the scraping process will bring what's below a little forward. So you can see it's a very messy process. There's a lot of cursing and crying in the process. And sometimes, because I use a torch to fuse all the layers together, because you don't want them to stay as individual layers or they can just peel off of one another. So what you essentially do is have to meld them all together into a solid piece, but you want to do that without ruining the layer below, although that sometimes happens. So the one on the left, you see how it's wrecked. The one on the right, I took my tools and dug out the melted areas. And then that's the big repair there in the middle, which I then scrape down again before adding the next layer. And that's the final piece after all the layers have been built up. This is probably the biggest piece I ever did. This is what I kept. And that just kind of shows you from different angles what the final achievement is of the layers floating above one another. This is a piece that's in the show and details of that one and the last detail of that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Haskelo. When I first started working in encaustic, I wanted to try and figure out how to incorporate using rust with the melted wax. I have a collection of odds and ends of iron pieces, and I did some research and found out that if I roughed up the surface of the wrought iron, and then if I soaked them in a solution of salt water and hydrogen peroxide, I could rust them even more. The salt water helps speed up the rusting process, and then the hydrogen peroxide oxidizes to make the iron corrode. It takes about 2 weeks for this solution to completely dry, and then I'm left with a stash of pieces that were covered in rust particles. So the next step is to take a sheet of rice paper and place it over the rusted piece, and then spray that with a solution of white vinegar and water. The vinegar, white vinegar is commonly used as a rust remover, so it transfers the rust to the paper. So it made these really cool random patterns on the paper. And so I focused on using rust on my pieces for a few years. Here's some samples. And here are some samples that are in the exhibit with some details. So at this point, I sort of got tired and bored with doing the same thing. So I thought I would try experimenting with using powdered pigments, both natural and metallic. I had a long, narrow piece of dye bond, and I saw this pattern of a heartbeat. So I thought maybe I would use it as a base for my next piece. I tinted the encaustic gesso blue with the pigment and painted that. Once that was dry, I put two coats of the clear encaustic medium. And then I used a brush and used white metallic encaustic and echoed the heartbeat shape. And then the bottom, I started using the blowtorch to melt that. And then I wanted to try to experiment to see what would happen if I put powdered pigment on top of that. So I used the blowtorch, and I was able to control the direction that the powdered pigment was going in. And then as it melted the encaustic, it fused together and made this sort of fluid organic shape. Here are some pieces that are in the show with the details. This is one that was in a juried exhibit out at the Encaustic Art Institute in Santa Fe. This one I went ahead and painted on top of the surface on India ink, which gave it more of a graphic look. This one I actually used the rusted particles in with the encaustic. And this one again is a combination of the metallic powdered pigment and the encaustic. And this one's my favorite. It actually, somehow I managed to have bronze metallic colored encaustic medium, and it matched the bronze metallic powdered pigment, which was amazing. And so when I finished this piece, I really liked it. I just felt like it was an expression of what the world was going through the last couple months. So thank you. Marty?
Hi, I'm Marty Itner, an encaustic artist and printmaker. I bring elements of visual language and environmental activism to my work. I'm going to show you how I make an encaustic monoprint, which I do it a little differently than Kathy does, but it's still the same kind of idea. So this piece is called Time on Earth. Time on Earth is a statement on the transient and trajectory of our life on this planet. Beginning and ending with a whimper, it swells in our prime. There are times of brilliance and stretches of gray. Life's arc echoes Earth's daily rotation. So again, like Kathy, I have a hot anodized steel plate that's over a heating unit, and you take the colored encaustic and just smear it on there and it melts like that. This is a little video showing how you can add texture to the wax with a little comb that I found. And this is actually the printing plate for that piece. It's just a piece of newsprint that I cut the circles out of. And that goes on top of the wax that you just saw. And then I put the piece of paper on top of that stencil and use a brayer to rub down the paper on top of the wax. And then the wax adheres to the paper. And that's a detail of the print. So many people in our collective use very heavy, thick applications of the encaustic, and I go to the other extreme of using very little wax. And so this is about as little wax as you'll see in the show. So that's, but it is made with encaustic onto the paper. This is my series called The Torrid Zone, which deals with global warming. The base print is an encaustic monoprint, which you've just seen. And I have a figure etched in glass that is hovering above the print, casting a shadow, suggesting humanity's impact on our planet. This is another close-up of the Torrid Zone series, and you can see the iridescent color of the encaustic and the random patterns that happen with the encaustic monotype. This is a piece called On Thin Ice. One of those panels is in the show, hanging in front of the window. I really like the way the encaustic on paper makes it translucent, and I love the light coming through that really pops the colors. This piece was done for the triptych window. It's the Strathmore Museum in Bethesda. And talking about encaustic collage here. So I'm a bird watcher, and I love these old images of ducks, and they've been turned into each one is a collage with encaustic and found materials. Diadema is a type of sea urchin, and I love this spiny shape of it. And again, I'm using found materials, encaustic medium, encaustic color, to put all these together. And this, we all took Katie's collage class, and this is the type of things that we learned in her class, which really got me addicted to the encaustic process. This is, I'm also a printmaker. This is a collograph print, and I'm able to use encaustic with a print, with a base print, and coat the print with the encaustic, and then use the same kind of incising that David was showing, where you draw shapes in and you can fill the shapes with color. So it's a really, really nice tactile way of adding additional color onto a paper print. I also work with cyanotype printing. In 2014, I had a show at the Delaplane called Tangled Up in Blue, which dealt with plastic pollution in our oceans. Sadly, this issue is even worse now than it was then. My show featured a grid of starfish, which each one is a cyanotype with an encaustic coating on it and the incised shapes and colors, as I was just talking about. So here's a detail of one of those starfish, and you can see the yellow area in the middle is added with the encaustic. And the encaustic colors are quite, they're quite brilliant, and they really add to prints. This piece is called Mainstream, which is also deals with trash and things that go into our waterways. And this is a cyanotype base with added collage elements. And that's it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie Del Kaufman, and I'm a encaustic sculptor, painter, printmaker, educator. And here we have some examples of my paintings in pigment, powdered pigment on the top, a collage made out of encaustic monotype or monoprint, and I've added encaustic and shellac to the inside of one of my sculptures. I also teach in the Washington metropolitan area. Here we have an example of classes at Pyramid Atlantic in Hyattsville, Maryland. But I've also taught at the Lee Arts Center, the Capitol Hill Arts Workshop, as well as the Tacoma Park Community Center. My work has been featured in The Encaustic Art in the 21st Century, a book by E. Ashley Rooney. And a version of what I'm going to be describing today was written up in an article in Encaustic Arts Magazine, which is out of the Encaustic Arts Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So this is the process that the article was about. And in my early explorations in encaustic, I began experimenting with using powdered pigment with encaustic medium, which is beeswax plus resin, by pushing it through an antique Asian silkscreen, which you see at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. I don't know if you can see, it's got a screen background and these images are suspended in the screen. Now, with working with powdered pigments, it's essential to use protective gear, such as goggles and a respirator, which you see me wearing here. And I would press the pigment through the mesh of the silkscreen and define the image suspended within the screen on top of a multiple layer piece of wax medium. So later, when I would heat it from above very, very slowly, the pigment would just drop into the wax. Here you can see another example of this process. This trio of pieces, sort of the life cycle of a butterfly. And in the larger piece in the show, Ex Libris, I've included another version of this process. My most recent series includes shadow boxes and panels. And here we have the shadow box In and Out of Time that is in the show. The shadow box itself is created by having a recessed pocket in the center. And in that, I use Old English wooden type. But before using the type as assemblage, I used it to print on the collage papers in the piece. And so the bottom layer of collage imagery mirrors the objects in the box. You can see the center of the box in the center before I put the wax down, and then the overall piece to the right. Then I apply multiple layers of wax and collage paper to both the frame and the central panel. And I compose with line, shape, color, and depth of wax. I add positive and negative shapes of opaque encaustic paint and use shapes cut out of heat-resistant Duralar to maintain the consistency of the circles. To the right is the finished piece called Crossroads. But what is interesting to me about this process and exciting is what happens in the process of the work itself. I make choices. In this case, one of the choices I made was to use colors and shapes in the top layer of the painting, specifically referencing semaphore and nautical flags. But what shifted during the process was that in juxtaposition with the antique type and the layers of wax, the piece began to feel like it was moving forward and backward in time and conjuring up images for me, sort of out of nowhere, about seagoing vessels that navigated their course by measuring the winds and consulting the constellations. See, I love this. I love this part of the process. It's why I work with the wax. It's so evocative and it sort of triggers my unconscious. So what it started also as simple dotted lines and overlapping grid patterns emerged as street corners and pedestrian walkways. And with that came contrastingly contemporary images of navigating city streets in metropolitan areas. And the large circles punctuating the work brought up yet another reference to traversal of time and exploration, suggesting intimate views into macro and microscopic worlds in the laboratory or into the cosmos. So for me, this process is the wonderful thing about encaustic. The wax becomes part of the story. And with it, you can engage this intuitive dance with your intention and your unconscious, along with the medium. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Today, I'd like to show some pieces in the current show, discuss the process of one of the pieces, but I'm going to start with showing some images of things that really interest me and that visually inspire me. In a way, I think they all have some impact on how I work on my pieces. And it's not really my intent to directly imitate, but certainly there are some formally related aspects to these. For many years, I've had a strong interest in textures, rock formations, moss, clouds in particular. I love images from space, also images from a microscope. I'm fascinated with the similarities of form and texture from the macro to the micro. And it says something to me about the interconnectedness of nature. In my own work, I try to express this fascination by walking a line of ambiguity of scale, which hopefully encourages a viewer to create their own narrative and make their own interpretation. The elemental circle or sphere is a mode that I return to quite often. And an exploration of a new technique often leads me back to test this form again and again. And I've returned to this orb series many times throughout my work in encaustic. Wax is great because you can actually scrape it off if it didn't work out, but also just asking the question, I wonder what would happen if I did this, or if I did that, sometimes leads to a new technique or a new interpretation, I think, of this primal form that I often come back to. A recent foray into the orb series led me to a new technique and to a new series that explores the line. Not a hard line, but a separation, a boundary, as in mercurial, this piece. And I'd like to, at this point, to focus on another piece in that series and show you several states of it from beginning to end. First, though, this piece, as well as a lot of my recent pieces, depends on colors of wax that I mix up myself with pigments that I found, rare earth pigments like lapis lazuli or alizarin crimson that came from the most amazing store in New York City that specializes in just pigments. The result is wax that is translucent and allows light to penetrate down through the surface. And at the start of this piece, a thin strip of metal divides the board as a precise center working point. And after that, precision just goes out the window, and I can let loose and squiggle and swirl as the music in my studio and the images in my head inspire me. This is a view after the first layers of dancing wax. Then multiple layers go on in the colors that I've mixed. I use a torch to then fuse and cause the colors to gather in the low points of the piece and then the squiggles and the raised points start to emerge. Then begins a process of carefully scraping back the layers, more torching, more scraping to reveal the figure that has started out from below. This is after more scraping, and I'm in the process at this point of shaping the central metal form. This is a 50-50 mix of lead tin that I also use the torch to shape and mold and move around. You don't do that on the wax, you do that on a piece of ceramic or concrete, and then it gets laid back onto the wax. And this is the finished piece where I think the metal has become more assertive. And the wax is very smooth, polished, and has a sheen that feels to me something like ceramic. Another mode that I return to on a regular basis is using natural materials like roots as well as found objects. And in this series, I selected very personal objects and knitted them into a composition that uses, in this case, a basil root from my garden, a die that a good friend gave me, along with a key, which is one of my collecting passions. I collect keys. Small metal orbs weave in a hidden geometry into this piece. Number 4 is obviously the 4th in the series, and I photographed it here on an angle so that you can see the depth of the frame and how the pieces have a strong three-dimensionality. This series was inspired by the work of Joseph Cornell. And in this one, I have a rosemary root that came out of my garden, a ceramic antique marble, a piece of hardware that came from the house that I live in, that I've lived in for quite a while, and a small pebble that I collected on a trip to Fire Island, just to the east of New York City, and that trip ended on September 10th, 2001. And finally, in this most recent series, this most recent piece, I've returned back to the orb series. I used in this piece 23 karat gold to create reflections that change depending on the light, from intensely bright when it's in the sun to very subtle with a subordinate glow to the wax that surrounds and underlies the leaf. As an architect, I come back to simple geometry over and over again, but it's sort of an underlying organization that allows me to express and sort of let loose with what goes over the top of it. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, it's just so fascinating seeing your different approaches to the mediums, and sort of, it's such a good representation of the versatility of the medium as well. It seems like you could go in 1,000 different directions, which is fantastic. It looks like there's a few comments, and we want to make sure that we allot some time for some questions. Juanita Rockwell says specifically about Katie, but then it opens up more generally. I love that Katie talks about how the form and the content of her work interact, and how the layers of wax infer the layers of time spent creating and interacting with the work. Like insects in amber, does the literal depth of a specific piece, like the shadow box, affect how you see the form and meaning connect over the time spent creating? Do you think of encaustic as a kind of sculpture? That's open for anybody to answer if any of you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll mention that I started off as a sculptor and was a welded steel sculptor. So I spent a lot of time heating stuff up and combining it with the heat. And I don't often think about that now, that here I am heating stuff up and combining it with heat, and finding that things that don't usually go together can go together in this process. But I also, I think it's very personal for me. I'm not sure others in the group think about time as one of the elements of my work, and not the time it takes to make it, but the atmospheric effect that the wax creates for me. So if you're looking at something through the misty layers of wax, for me, there's also a looking through layers. Oh, and even in David's pieces, the things that happened before, and then next, the layering gives you this sense that it's a part of a process and you're seeing the process right before your eyes.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I mean, just thinking about I wonder if any of you can talk about the choices that you're left making about what you want to hide, what you want to reveal, what you want to hint at subtly. Any specific thoughts in that direction?
I know with me, part of it is how far can I push it and still reveal something? How deep can you look,
Right.
and when might it disappear? And part of that is just experimentation with the process. But it also, I think, goes back to what Katie says about time. It feels like the passage of time to look through those layers and let them reveal themselves to you.
I wanted to say also Nancy's work combines the two, the rust, which is also time.
It is time, yeah.
In the process of combining it with the wax, it really gives that kind of history of the material. And because I think all of us seem to be a little bit material based. There's a real feeling that all the materials have like a lifespan of their own too.
Yeah, the assemblage stuff seems to work in that direction too. I mean, any of you that have done assemblage, you're using artifacts that they at least bear some sort of resemblance to the things that they've passed through, the hands that they've passed through. And so that component is really interesting to me. We have a couple of questions. Let's see, Diana has a few questions. And I'm gonna read a couple of them and you guys can just tackle them. But Diana asked Marty specifically, what is colograph? And then Kevin, in your Roots series, Diana asked if there was a formula, and how did you decide where to place the silver dots? I think the little spheres, I forget what you called them, but in the Roots series.
First of all, hey, Diana. A colograph is basically mounting things on a hard surface. What I had there was a leaf, and it was mounted onto a piece of cardboard, and then you ink up the leaf and you run it through a printing press, put a piece of paper on top, so it mirrors the piece that you've put underneath it. So it was a leaf that under there that gets transferred to the piece of paper. You can pretty much colograph anything. Somebody was running stuffed animals through the press. Just throw the teddy bear on there and just run it through, and that's a colograph.
Yeah. So yes, Diana, there are the little orbs are actually upholstery tacks that I have utilized. But the geometry is, yes, there are squares. There are arcs. For example, there's a particular rectangle that is formed by taking the diagonal of a square and then casting that up to form a particular proportion. And then there's the golden section. And what I do is I overlay these geometries, but then I'll remove a piece. So it's not specifically literal, the square, like I'll pull out one of the corners, or I'll I'll bisect one of the sides, and sometimes the objects, for example, that lay across the bottom of the piece also have a relationship to that geometry that's sort of underlies the, but it's not drawn out specifically. You kind of have to figure it out.
Kristen asks in the chat over here, Nancy, I think she's talking specifically to you about rice paper. She said, what's the significance of using rice paper? And I guess maybe, and she has more to the question, but I wanted to hit this first. Is rice paper more susceptible to receiving the rust? Is that kind of the idea?
Well, it's really thin paper, but it's pliable. So the thicker paper didn't work. So if I use the thin rice paper, then when I lay it on top of a color encaustic medium, then you can, it kind of becomes translucent. So it kind of adds to the translucency of the encaustic.
Yeah, gotcha. So the second part of her question is, seeing as encaustic requires many tools, materials, and techniques, she's wondering how this amazing expression could be more accessible to creative people in general. And I guess I want to tack on to that question, like, what's a good place to start? Like, if people are interested in starting, is it a matter of going and picking up a few materials and without a lot of the tools on hand that most people won't have, what's one way that they can at least dip their toe in the water, I guess?
Take Katie's class.
Take Katie's class.
Yeah, I would like to answer that because I'm on Facebook with a group of encaustic artists, and they asked that question, where can I learn to do this? And it's basically through a class. The easiest and most efficient way of learning is through a class. And then you collect tools from everywhere. Like he's using upholstery text. I'm using drywall correction tape. They aren't necessarily tools that are specific to encaustic. They're just things you pick up to use that make it work.
Kathy's a genius at that. She did a piece with biscuit tins, I think, that's still one of my favorite. Had big lumps of beautiful color embedded. It was beautiful. She'll spot anything in a kitchen store or a hardware store and turn it into an encaustic tool.
It's true.
I will say there's a difference between the collage, where you can just bring your box of stuff that you've been collecting over the years, and all you need is the clear encaustic and a melting pot and a paintbrush, and you're good to go. And that's very low entry point. But if you want to get into the colors, right, like David and Kathy and Katie and Kevin, those little blocks of color are expensive, and that's a whole nother, that's a next level of wanting to get involved.
Encaustic art is an expensive art. This is not a cheap art. The wax is expensive, the colors are expensive. It's just an expensive art. So you have to be willing to invest in it.
Over time, I have discovered, though, because I've taught both encaustic collage and encaustic monotype or monoprinting, you can buy little crock pots and you can mix pigments into encaustic medium, which you can also make, you don't have to buy. So you're mixing just the beeswax and the resin and a whole lot of graphite powder. You can then pour that mixture into little silicone trays that they sell at IKEA, and they create like little pencils, and then you can draw on a heated surface. Mm-hmm. So it's, once you've done it the more expensive way, and you figure out how you want to, what road you want to go down, then you do figure out, oh, I don't need to buy this or that or the other. I can just get the crock pot, get the wax, and do a mixture that meets my needs, with or without, for instance, with or without resin. Because if you're doing what anybody who's trying to get a shiny surface, like Kevin and David, need the resin. But if you are working with encaustic on a plate to pull prints, you don't need the resin. So you learn over time what the medium demands.
You can also make your colors using oil paint. If you have I have a set of oil paints, you can take the oil paint and sort of drain some of the oil out of it, and then put that paint into wax and create a colored wax, which is a cheaper way of doing it than buying the pre-made colors.
With you all being so close to us, I'm wondering if we should explore some workshop potential in the future. We would love to figure out ways that we can partner with you guys in the future and spread the wealth of your ideas to folks. I think another question just came through. So Barbara Morris asks, how has being in a collective influenced each of you in the evolution of your work over the years?
Good question.
Well, I steal stuff from David all the time.
Yeah, get in line. No, the truth of it is that it's kept, at least for me, and I think for the others, you look at our work, it's all so different from one another. There are things that we borrow from each other and learn from each other, but I think it just keeps us motivated, because the next time we meet, we want to talk about what we've learned, what we want to learn, or the problems we've had, but it gives us a reason to keep going. And it's made it easier for us, I think, to do shows, because, you know, we don't have to each fill up a whole gallery, right? And then convince a gallery owner that, okay, just me, all me. It I think has enough variety as a group that it makes it attractive, you know, in a lot of different ways.
I've also found it helpful that when we meet, we bring pieces in and we have each other talk about them. And some of the information that I've gotten from the others has helped me make my piece better with the critique. It's very, very helpful.
Well, I think a lot is also in the materials, because there's so many different materials that are available. Like Nancy discovered the dye bond, which is a great surface. It's inexpensive. I'm always looking for inexpensive solutions. So the dye bond is a nice substrate to work on, and she came up with that. And so we definitely, you know, trade ideas about materials, and the critiques are super helpful too, because nobody's holding back any punches.
It helps us not all make the same mistake, because once one person's made that mistake, we don't have to all make it. So
Right.
You bring that to the table.
Well, I think we're about at the end of our time. I want to thank you all so much. I want to encourage everyone again to the digital images that you guys had, even in your slideshow and the virtual exhibition that we have, are lovely, but there's nothing like seeing the work in person. And so if anybody watching can make it out to the exhibition, I would encourage you to do that. But again, things are up. Washington Waxworks, you guys, it was really fascinating talking to you. Thank you all so much for your hard work and putting in time to be with us today and answering our questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again to all of our artists and participants. While you're on our channel, check out our other videos, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified about other new videos from the Delaplane. Thanks again for watching.